Africa, you see. Africa, you know. Africa, you understand. Africa, you celebrate. On KAAKAKI, the African voice.
All right, thank you so much for staying with us. We're still looking at flood in Benue State, the devastation and rehabilitation with a specialist on environmental protection, on causes, prevention, and rehabilitation of victims. And so we're joined by climate change and environmental expert, the Professor of Environmental Law and Climate Change Policy, Dr. John Osonwa. Always glad to have you join us.
Always good to be here.
So what's your evaluation of the devastation of the flood in Benue State?
It's catastrophic. I've looked at the aerial pictures. It's reminiscent of what we saw in Houston. Other than the nature of the structures, you couldn't even distinguish which flood terrain you're looking at. So that tells me that it's catastrophic. It's not just serious. Because you look at some of the pictures, the houses are completely submerged to the roof level, which means that whatever was inside that house is either evacuated or lost. So it's worrying, because you remember 2012 we were sitting right here talking about flooding, what to do, and I said, not because I'm a prophet, but just looking at the fundamentals of what is causing the flooding in Nigeria and elsewhere, I said that we're going to have recurrent floods. Floods will be more devastating. They will be more frequent, because when you look at the fundamentals, many of them have not been addressed, both in terms of the larger global climate change scenario and also with regard to what is happening in Nigeria here.
But the Nigerian Hydrological Service Agency had long warned that certain states, including Benue, will be one of those states. Are you worried that they didn't prepare adequately for this?
Of course, it's worrying, because when you look at our preparedness, it tends to focus on relief and response. Much of what we've been dealing with has to do with the extent of relief, the adequacy of the response, and things like that. I want to break away this year, because we've been talking about this for 5-6 years now. I want to break away and begin to make some and focus in a different area.
Right.
And that is the area of planning and prevention. We know, given the existing science now, there are things you can do to prevent flooding in certain communities. There are things you can do to mitigate flooding. Flooding is a natural phenomenon. You cannot completely eradicate it, because you can't always predict the amount of rainfall you would have. Even places like Texas, where they thought they were ready, hurricane Harvey proved otherwise, because the amount of rainfall was unprecedented in the history of the U.S. So you're going to have events that would overwhelm your conception of what should happen. So we need to be proactive in the preventive arena. And what do we need to do when I say that? You look at the structure of Nigeria now in terms of government and public response to flooding. There is a lacuna. In law, we say lacuna, basically a gap. There is a gap. And that gap exists because you have NIMET, which historically has been very good at telling us what will happen, warning us, even sending specific warnings to states with timelines. So I think NIMET has done a beautiful job over the years, at least in the years that I've been tracking their activities. You also have NEMA, which, given the extent of their resources and their challenges, they seem to be trying also. Keep in mind, NEMA also has counterpart state level, CIMA, that are supposed to work in sync with the national one. But sometimes you find that the CIMA at the state level, they are not very active. They are not very equipped. So what do we need to do to fill that gap? NIMET is good at prediction. NEMA is good at post-flood response, emergency agency. In between, there's a gap in Nigeria. So I think what the presidency needs to do, because I'm sure he's troubled when you hear 110,000 people displaced, people have died in Lokogoma, Suleja.
That's one they can find.
So when you hear that people are dying, as a leader of the country, you need to do some things. What I would recommend to whomever is listening, we need a task force specifically tagged flood prevention and mitigation. Whatever you call it, whether it's department, agency, commission, is up to you. But their focus will be strictly to look at what we have now. There needs to be a map, a flood map,
Okay.
a clearly identified flood map. You also need to have flood warnings. In the U.S., we have sirens. When the water reaches a certain level, you have the sirens, will, even if it's in the middle of night, sirens will go off so you know that there's a threat. You begin to evacuate. Even if you can't see the water yet, that siren tells you that there's danger coming because it has reached a certain level. The other thing we need to do, places like River Benue, River Niger, and those areas, even Lagos, the island, the beautiful island, locales that we love so much, they're also under threat. We need to build barriers and levees. That's what places like that around the world have. You build concrete barriers that will give you a measure of protection. If you had a 10-foot barrier along the Lagos coastline in strategic areas and also along portions of River Niger and Benue, we wouldn't be having this flooding. And the technology is there, the money is there. We just need to put it where it belongs.
Talking about, all of this money being there and putting it where it belongs, what exactly is missing? Because we saw in 2012 a very devastating flood that affected virtually all the states, across the country, and about 17.4 billion naira was released.
Yes.
What should the government be doing at this point when it comes to financial releases as intervention funds for problems like this? What should they be looking at? Should it be purchasing relief materials, for instance, or should it be on capacity building or developing desks to fill in this gap that you actually identified earlier?
It brings us to the Ecological Fund. We have, for many, many years now, we've had an Ecological Fund, which is a certain percentage of the federal revenue goes to the Ecological Fund. It is from that fund that we run NEMA, the Great Green Wall, dealing with desertification in the north, and then the residue is shared between the federal and state and local tiers of government. The state governments are always getting money from the Ecological Fund. It's mixed in with the monthly allocation. Same thing goes with the local, which they also commingle with the state. The one that everybody haps on is the federal one because it's larger. So what is happening now is, I've also been very vocal about this. The way the Ecological Fund is run is flawed at 3 levels. You look at the structural level, it's subject to discretion of the president. It is a highly discretionary allocation. President decides where the money will go at a particular time. States apply, and then it goes to the Ecological Funds office. After that, they make a committee makes a recommendation. President has to approve it, and it's discretionary. They should remove the discretion. We should have clearly cut criteria that will tell you whether you can assess it or not. Second thing is you have so many points of contact, and in Nigeria, when you have many desks, that also amplifies the chance of corruption. You have 6 desks before you can access Ecological Fund. It doesn't need to be that way. Those are just points of bureaucracy and bottlenecks. So that's at the structural level. Then you're also looking at the award level. When this money is awarded, as I said, sometimes governors come. We have heard allegations, whether true or not, that when Jonathan was the president, he only gave the money to PDP supporting states or leaning states. And then now, El-Rufai, I think he was appointed head of this last dispensation, and he gave to those states that didn't get. So each state got 2 billion. There was no real identification of where that money will be plowed into. So I think that at the disbursement level, we have flaws. Then at the implementation level, which is where we have the biggest problem with the Ecological Fund, you have funds being given for things that have nothing to do with ecology. So NIT did an audit, and found that funds were used for cook stoves, 9 billion for cook stoves. They gave money to FCDA to build a mall. What has that got to do with ecology?
Okay, you are the Regional Coordinator, Society for Occupational Safety and Environmental Health.
Yes.
Now, looking at the issue of the number of persons in the Benue State IDP camp, the numbers will increase.
Yes.
There is also the risk of a health scare with cholera. What do you also advise in terms of rehabilitation?
Well, that's always the problem. You know, flooding comes with a myriad of issues. The immediate one, of course, is the loss of life, loss of property, loss of livelihoods. Some of these areas are farming areas. That's the breadbasket of the nation. You also have people engaged in aquaculture in this area. You have businesses along the banks, especially in Makodi. So you have that immediate loss. But history has shown us that when you now cluster people in this very damp and moist environment, you're going to have the buildup of mildew and mold and fungus and all those things that you don't want. Another problem we have, particularly in Nigeria, is that over 80 million Nigerians have no access to latrines and proper toilets. So a lot of them use the bushes to ease themselves. So when you have flooding like this, all those things, fecal matter, waste, gets washed into our streams, our rivers. Their drinking water sources are polluted. That eventually leads to cholera, to dysentery, even things like typhoid eventually will manifest, because those are all microbe origin diseases. So I am worried. So as you're trying to provide relief in terms of physical comfort, provide mattresses, provide food, there should also be the medical component to that. And we already know what typically manifests: cholera, diseases of the stomach. So you need to have proactive measures. And the beginning of that is good drinking water.
You've talked about flood prevention and mitigation, team, being set up.
Yes.
You recommended that. Now, the past, interview, the guest complained about lack of sensitization in the state, especially the citizenry participation.
Yes.
What is the role of the citizens in mitigating against flood within their immediate environment?
Thank you. I have always been a preacher of individual responsibility. I think we have abdicated a lot of the responsibilities that we ought to have, even for just mere purpose of self-preservation. You look at the way that we build. It begins with the building pattern. We're building haphazardly. A lot of times there's no real planning. Even when there's planning, at least in the books, it is flouted because people are passing envelopes and other things are happening that shouldn't happen. A lot of the things estates that we're building are not meant to be built in those zones. Some of those are drainage passageways, some of them are floodplains, some of them, if you look at the elevation, you know that you need major engineering works to avoid flooding, but people just build. So I always attribute that to lack of enforcement, failure of enforcement within the system. And it's a perennial problem we've had. It's not getting any better. So if you look at the challenges we have, sometimes you have to blame the individuals. A lot of people, they throw away their sachet water plastics and other so-called leather. I don't know why it's leather, it's plastic, but they know what I mean. They throw away their leather bags indiscriminately. Sachet water, they throw them indiscriminately. When you have a little breeze, all that stuff ends up in the gutter and it clogs it. And because it's not biodegradable, it can be there for years and years. So that's the problem we have. Our living structures are not properly monitored. The way we live, we're not being conscious of what could happen when the rains come. I always ask people, you have community organizations for various things. Why can't you also have that community organization at the onset of the rainy season use a Saturday and say, we're going to clean all our drainages? Not just clean, because I've seen where they will clean and pile it right next to the gutter, and then 2 days or 3 days later, it goes back. When you clean it, evacuate the stuff. So that helps the flow of water. And that's what we can do individually.
The flood prevention and mitigation flood map. Is it close? Can we closely link that to perhaps the dredging of some of these rivers? Because one of the issues that the Nigerian Hydrological Services Agency raised was the fact that waters will rise, the level of water in the rivers will rise. Now, what can be done to ensure that, you know, even when it rises, it doesn't overflow in banks?
Yes.
You know, talking about dredging.
In some areas, I think dredging is good. In some areas, you're just creating more space for the water to move faster. The reason is we are interlinked with Cameroon, especially in this axis that we're focusing on today. Cameroon, a lot of the water that you see is actually coming out of the Cameroon mountain range. That valley range produces a lot of runoff that comes into Nigeria. So when it's the Cameroon has a dam, as we know, Lagdo Dam has been built to cushion the effects of flooding and to provide other services for them. But Nigeria did not build its own dam, the counterpart dam, Dasin Hausa Dam. It was supposed to be built in Adamawa. Cameroon built its own in 1982, and we have been planning. We've been at the planning stage. Last time I made inquiries, the ministry said that they were getting ready to do procurement. That was in 2015. And I can assure you, I don't think that dam has been built, but I'm going to check again now that we've come up with this. So you're looking at, for over 15, 20 years, we haven't built our counterpart dam. So Cameroon, naturally, would protect its citizens. When that dam reaches a certain level, if you don't release some of the water, it's like a pressure valve, then the whole dam could collapse. So they have to do the needful to preserve their own environment. But when they release that water, it flows into our own river basins and floods our citizens here. So there's a failure of leadership with regard to that, Lama. I want somebody to really look into that. We need to build that down. Because the prediction that I'm making is that we're going to have more floods. It's not because I hate people in this region. And the reasons are very clear. You look at the climate change reasons. I always refer people to the Arctic region of the world. If you're holding the world as a ball, football in your hand, which we should all relate to, given the Green Eagles. If you're holding a football, referee is holding a football. The top of that football is the Arctic region. And that area happens to be exactly the size of Africa. It is 30 million square kilometers. Africa, the whole continental Africa, is 30 million square kilometers. So that gives you a sense of the scale of the Arctic region, filled with ice. Ice that is, in some cases, up to about 50 meters. So that ice has been there for eons. But the problem we're having now is because of global warming. In that region, we have had, in the past 12 years, we've had 10 of the warmest years in succession. Every year eclipses the record. So that whole warming has melted the ice. More than half of that ice has melted already. Absolutely. And it keeps melting. So this Arctic region feeds waters into the Atlantic Ocean, feeds into the Pacific Ocean, feeds into the Greenland Sea, Barents Sea. So the whole world system of waters is interconnected. And that's why we're seeing the kind of flooding we saw in Houston and we'll see elsewhere, because the oceans are already higher than they used to be, and they will go higher if we continue with the way we are going with climate change. So because of that, you talk to people, they say, oh, which leads us back to sensitization. When you're trying to sensitize them, they will say, oh, we've always had flooding, our grandfathers had it, it's seasonal, after a few months it goes, we go back to normal. No, there is a new normal. That's why we talk about climate change. If you break it down to layman's term, it just means that the climate that you're familiar with is changing, and usually for the worse, not for the better.
I mean, you've given a clear picture of the environment assessment, and, you know, a lot of these environment impact assessments sometimes are not localized in real terms in different states. You're talking about climate change in real term. I can actually, you know, relate to it. The ordinary Nigerian might not be able to do the same. How do you think that these can become basic enough for them to enhance expression of it.
That's why I'm always pleased to appear on this wonderful platforms you people provide, because a lot of them are listening, a lot of them are watching. And when we keep harping on the same issue, you know, when we started this discussion 6-7 years ago, people didn't know what climate change was.
Absolutely.
Now, when you talk about climate, at least they have some relational concept of what it is. So we're getting there. We're making progress. But we can make more progress if the states become proactive in protecting their citizens. This area of flood remediation, flood mitigation, flood control, erosion happens to be on the concurrent list. So we can't always depend on the federal government. When you have things on the concurrent list, it means that the state government can weigh in. The federal government can also contribute its part. I think there's always too much reliance on the federal. What the federal can do for us. Let me borrow from my favorite president. Ask not what the federal government can do for you, but what you can do for yourself. I'm saying this to the state governors. There is nothing that prevents the state government from saying, look, we're going to gather a few experts, we'll look at our terrain, we'll look at our challenges, and we're going to craft a flood prevention plan, not response and sharing bread and mattress. I'm talking about actually preventing it or mitigating it to the point where it doesn't affect what is happening within the state. Because let me tell you something. When you have massive flooding within your state, you know, the governors may think they're immune. If you have massive flooding, as we have seen in Benue State, people are not going to work, businesses are not functioning, farmers have had their farmlands washed away. You now have to deal with emergency relief. You have to deal with increased diseases. So the burden on the state becomes very much. I will tell you, whatever projection they had of their internally generated revenue for this last quarter now is going to be diminished by at least half. So there's a direct impact on the state. So the state governors have a vested interest to even prevent this in the first place. So I say, use your ecological funds wisely, devote more funds to protecting your people, preventing flooding of this magnitude, and everybody will be happy in the end, including the governor himself.
Let's speak to climate change and the fact that there are concerns that the global temperature may rise from 2.5 degrees to about 10 degrees in next century. What kind of information should the state governments, for instance, have to begin to sensitize their citizens on certain practices, environmental practices? We do know that a lot of time climate change is caused by, emission of, greenhouse gases.
Yes.
How do state governments key in to begin to teach citizens?
Well, Nigeria happens to be the biggest contributor to climate change in Africa. Some people would doubt it, but you look at the evidence. And there are 4 things contributing to that. First one, and probably the most prominent one, is gas flaring. We are burning a lot of gas in the Niger Delta region. You see, when oil is extracted from the ground, it comes as an admixture of different things. You have to separate them out. They take what they need now and burn the gas. That is a major contributor to climate change in Africa. Then we have the issue of this failure to provide power and electricity. It's also affecting us in terms of climate change, because what do we use for substitute generators, both diesel and petrol? Those things, we have about 60 million generators in Nigeria at any given time burning fossil fuels, which contributes to climate change. That one is also a major contributor to our climate change profile. Then the other thing I talk about, our light bulbs. I've been harping on this. We're still using incandescent bulbs in so many of our homes and businesses. That we did a calculation. We're releasing about 200 billion pounds of carbon dioxide from the bulb, about 200 million bulbs. That's what you get in a year of carbon dioxide emission. So that is contributing greatly. Then finally, vehicle pollution. We don't have any emission standards on our roads. In the U.S., every year you go for emissions testing, they stick something in the exhaust of your car. If it exceeds a certain level, that car cannot drive. If you drive it, it's a criminal offense. You'll be arrested. Other countries have similar things. Our standards may not be as stringent as the U.S. standard, but we should at least have something that we're aspiring to. So those 4 things, and then of course you look at deforestation because of farming and other things that we're doing. when we deforest, we lose the forest's natural ability to help us absorb carbon, because that's what they do. So those things are making things difficult for us. What can governors do? That was the question. You look at these factors that are contributing to climate change and say, within your state, what can we do to reduce these factors and begin to have a clean environment? The key thing is really sensitization, that climate change is real, despite what Trump says. It is real, it is happening, it's getting worse, and we have to adapt. Another way that states can help their people is you need to look at climate resilient agriculture now. I'm into organic farming now, and what we call integrated organic farming, which means you use outputs from livestock to produce food. Then you use the food to feed the livestock. So it's all integrated organic. I'm into that now. So, and we are finding that you need to look at things like that within the agriculture chain in Nigeria. That's where the world is moving. We're now using some of these harmful chemicals and inputs that harm the environment. So another thing is improved varieties of crops and seeds. You can't just use your grandmother's corn again that you couldn't eat and plant. There are varieties of corn that can do so much more with so little. And that goes for just about every crop. So we need to preach that at the state level. Federal is doing its own part, but there's nothing that stops the state
so
from
all
doing
these
that.
practices are meant to reduce the impact of climate change, because the atmosphere becomes warmer.
Cleaner.
The atmosphere becomes warmer. If we keep up with these, environmental practices that are not healthy to the environment, so the environment becomes warmer, and then the Arctic ice melts, and then it falls into the rivers, and the water levels increase. Now, as the water level increase, what kind of investments do you think that the government should begin to do now? You mentioned dams, the construction of dams earlier, and of course dredging the rivers. What major investments should governments make at this point? At this immediate short-term investment that government should do?
I'm a little bit disappointed that since 2012 we haven't built more barriers along the coastlines, because that was one of the things I stressed. And if you look at a lot of these cities elsewhere in the world, they are building barriers to protect their citizens on the coastline. The Lagos area should have more sturdy barriers, concrete or whatever else you want to use. You need that, because what it does is at least it minimizes the chance that you're going to have flooding. If you have a barrier to a certain level and you have monitors, sensors on those barriers, as the water is rising, it reaches a certain level, a warning goes out. Whether you want to use a town crier or a bullhorn or whatever you want to use, people at least will be forewarned that there's something coming, and they will evacuate. The problem we have, if you look at some of the pictures of those who drowned, who were killed by the flood in 2012, as I have, what you will notice one significant thing. A lot of those people were in their night clothes, pajamas, shorts, things that people wear at night. So that lends credence to the fact that most of them were sleeping. And if you're sleeping when and as you know, most of the times big rains come at night, not by day. So if you're sleeping when the flood comes, most of the time there's no NEPA or whatever you call it. So there's no light. You're groping in the dark. Suddenly you're seeing things swelling. How do you cope? So the importance of having a siren or some kind of warning system becomes really very critical, because even at night you can hear it.
And you've also seen a lot of farmlands being washed away with the flood, and the farmers are also worried about how to get back to normalcy.
In fact, the state governor, Samuel Tom, did mention the fact that large portions of farmlands were also affected, and it could lead to some level of food shortage within the state.
I'm sure it will.
Food insecurity.
I'm sure it will. With the pictures I've seen,
All right. Thank you so much. a climate change and environmental expert, Dr. John Osonwa. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure having you talk to us. He's been talking to us about the flooding, causes, prevention, and preparing for rehabilitation of the Benue State victims. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, he has given very vital, insightful, recommendations. And I think if you're listening in the federal government or the state government, perhaps you might want to find out what the way forward is and see how you can contact him. Well, let's see what Kaduna is going to be talking about. Chinelo says we're going to be looking at education in northern Nigeria, concern over quality of teachers. And it's coming from our